This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. I know firsthand why and how democracy is dying, wrote Maria Ressa, the CEO of the news agency Rappler, in her foreword to a new policy report from the Forum on Information and Democracy's Working Group on Infodemics. I'm Damian Collins, and in this podcast, I'll be discussing with Maria how her work exposing corruption in the Philippines now leaves her facing charges of cyber libel and a substantial jail sentence. Also, the dangers to democracy and society when Facebook, as it has in the Philippines, effectively becomes the internet in your country. We'll also be hearing from our resident disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel. Maria Ressa, it's fantastic to have you joining us all the way from Manila for the podcast. I say all the way, I'm in London, you're in Manila, but we have people that listen to the podcast in the Philippines and around the world as well. Many of you will know you for your sort of campaigning work as the chief executive of Rappler, the news organisation, and the brilliant work you've done with them. But also, you are someone who's been a very outspoken voice calling for tackling disinformation, reform of social media companies like Facebook. And you've been involved in a number of different reports looking at Facebook and the need for reform. And I was particularly interested in the recent report you co-authored from the working group on infodemics. And I thought what you said at the start of your introduction to that report, I thought was particularly telling, that you know from experience that democracy is dying and you know why it's happening. And for you, it would seem that the control of news and the social media aspect of news is a key component in that, and that is in itself a threat to democracy.
No, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Damian, thank you so much for the great work you have done on this, the investigation and the reports that you and your team have put together. I mean, the UK's report on this was something that I read voraciously. Look, I'm living through this. I could go to jail because I'm doing my job. And the core of this is really the change in the gatekeeping role of the public sphere, right? It used to be that news organizations, journalists were gatekeepers. We were accountable for what we published. And we took that responsibility seriously with standards and ethics manuals that news groups lived by. Well, as you know, tech has taken over, and they've taken the distribution of news and the money that comes with that, but they've abdicated responsibility for it. The designs of these social media platforms actually allow lies laced with anger and hate to spread faster and further than facts. We are being insidiously manipulated because of the business model, and it happens on a minute per minute basis through our devices, right? So, the engineers will call this optimization. I call it insidious manipulation. But the platforms we get our news from, social media platforms, are biased against facts. They're biased against journalists, and they are the very same platforms that are used to attack us. For example, in my case, narratives are seeded. In 2016, journalist equals criminal was seeded, targeting me, targeting my news group, Rappler. Well, what was laughable in 2016, you fast forward 4 years later, by 2017, the same exponential lies were coming bottom up, then were joined by President Duterte coming top down in his State of the Nation address. A week later, I get the first subpoena for me and Rappler. In 2018, I get 11 charges. It's me and Rappler, always me. I'm a favorite, I guess. And then in 2019, I have 8 arrest warrants, 8 criminal cases for me and Rappler. And 2020, I forgot the arrests. I was arrested, right? Arrested twice in a 5-week period, posted bail 8 times in order to stay free and to do my job. And in 2020, I am convicted. Probably the fastest cyber libel story. I'm convicted for a story that we published 8 years ago, in 2012. So a story I didn't write, edit, or supervise. And at a time when the law we supposedly violated didn't even exist.
And what was the nature of the story, and why did people take such exception to it?
Actually, they didn't take exception to it, which is why it's very Kafkaesque for me, in the sense that this is the story I could go to jail for up to 6 years. Uh, it's a story. It's a public interest story of our then Supreme Court Chief Justice was going through an impeachment trial, and the story just pointed out that he was going back and forth. He was arriving in court using the car of a businessman who had stories about him. This is the businessman who filed the case um, for cyber libel, and a businessman who also had a daughter campaigning. Um, Pulled into the president's political party as a party list member, also was able to deal with the government. So it's very interesting to me the way power and money works, and the way social media has taken this to new lengths, new lows that put journalists at greater risk.
And the new laws that have been brought in the Philippines, I mean, do you think they've been designed deliberately to suppress investigative journalism, silence people who are critical of senior figures in the country?
This law, cyber libel, was introduced in 2012. We actually campaigned against it because we felt that it could be weaponized against journalists, which is exactly what happened. Right, the Philippines is a country where the libel is a criminal act. And that's part of the reason the first arrest warrant that I received when I was arrested and taken and detained overnight, it was for this, for cyber libel. And just over the weekend, uh, can I ask you? I'll say this. When will this air, Damian? Should I just talk about the new arrest, the ninth arrest warrant that I received?
Yes, this will probably air later this week.
Okay, because then I'll be at a hearing. But just on Friday, last Friday, it's the beginning of a long weekend, and I received my ninth arrest warrant, and I barely made it to court to post bail. And again, this is something that this didn't exist in my world before as a journalist. I mean, I was an investigative reporter. I worked for, I ran bureaus for CNN in Southeast Asia. This is just a whole new level of harassment and intimidation that makes your world extremely uncertain, makes you have to think through every piece you publish. And that's the goal. That's the goal, to make you cautious and to, to pound you to silence.
Now, many people, I think, certainly in the UK, when we discuss these issues and the issues of disinformation on social media, they say, well, there are lots of other news outlets and people can get their information elsewhere. And do people really believe what they see on Facebook? But I think actually that underestimates the massive influence of social media in the way people consume news today. But I think that's particularly the case in a country like the Philippines, where I think the case is about 80% of people are Facebook users, and Facebook has really become probably the main channel for distributing information.
As of, I think, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, it's 100%. 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. So Facebook definitely is our internet. Look, yes, I've heard the government say that. The largest broadcaster in the Philippines, so this is the largest television network, ABS-CBN. This is a news group that I came home to manage in 2005. This was shut down May 5th this year, in the middle of a pandemic lockdown. The government essentially, like with Rappler, an agency, a lower level agency, gives them a notice, and within a few hours, they're dark. The last time ABS-CBN was forced to shut down was in 1972, when martial law was declared. Here, it's far more insidious, right? The government ostensibly says, we're not granting your franchise for the next 25 years. But again, this just shows you the actions of a captured legislature, because President Duterte a few years ago threatened ABS-CBN, toe the line, or you won't get your franchise. When the shutdown happened, and when the legislature, when a select committee on the House of Representatives actually took away their franchise, the palace said, we had nothing to do with it. That's very much like saying other outlets are there. what we're seeing here is that if you are independent, if you question power, if you do investigative reporting, there will be repercussions, and it hangs a Damocles sword over every hard-hitting journalist. And the challenge is to keep doing the reporting, right? Because if enough of us continue to do that, then we fight for press freedom at great personal cost. But what happens? Look at, when ABS-CBN was shut down, that had a massive chilling effect on journalists, and the jailing of journalists, the killings of journalists, these continue. So it's a difficult time, but I guess, we're still here and we continue. So I get a lot of optimism out of that.
But there's, as well as the attacks on mainstream journalism, it would seem that one of the big problems in the Philippines is also the manipulation of social media by bad actors, if you like, to try and mislead people and frighten and intimidate people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in 2016, we came under attack because Rappler challenged the impunity of two men, of Rodrigo Duterte and Mark Zuckerberg. I came under intense attack on Facebook to the tune of 90 hate messages per hour, because we published a 3-part series looking at the weaponization of social media, at how social media was being used. And in this case, the data that we had showed that they were pro Duterte, pro-government, with the most recent takedown, for example, that was done by Facebook on September 22. It was a story that we had mapped. We showed you these influence operations that were linked to the Philippine police and military, targeting perceived enemies of the administration. Here's the reality, and you know this, Damian, because you pointed this out. Social media, in its optimization for maximum revenues, has become a behavior modification system. And it is ripe for exploitation by governments like the Duterte administration. And I feel this is where it becomes very personal. It's like there's no way that that the arrest that happened to me last year, being arrested twice in a 5-week period, there's part of the reason it's accepted also by our people is because the groundwork is laid down. It's like the social media conspiracy theories and the death by 1,000 cuts of reputation, they happen. It's like fertilizer on the ground, paving the way for government actions. So let's think about it like this. Let's put it in the context of US elections. If you look at President Trump's constant statements about how he was cheated in the elections up until last night, right? This kind of statement was actually seeded, and I'm going to quote the work of the Election Integrity Partnership, but they were seeded, this idea of election fraud was seeded in August 2019. That's when the narrative was seeded on social media in the United States, and then was amplified, was mainstreamed from August 2020 to September 2020. And this was done through, so who did it first? Russia Today, RT. And then after RT in early August, Steve Bannon talks about it on YouTube. It was like a roadshow, amplified on YouTube, seeded in private groups. And then when President Trump says the exact same thing, it's been repeated. I also say this, a lie told a million times, a lie repeated a million times on social media today becomes a fact. This is the problem.
Absolutely. And I think the US election has brought this into sharper focus, but it's a problem that's existed for a long time. And I think, and I think also there's more scrutiny of what happens in America and in Europe. But if you look elsewhere around the world, you see even more egregious examples of how social media can be exploited by powerful people. But this I think clearly is where the social media companies have a responsibility, because people may express an opinion, but it's the tools of social media that amplify that opinion to large audiences. And I think that's where the social media companies should be held responsible for allowing that to happen.
Absolutely. Sacha Baron Cohen said this in his speech to the Anti-Defamation League, right? We all have freedom of speech, but you're not entitled to freedom of reach, especially if it is a lie, right? And I think that's the other part that's truly dangerous, because what we are seeing is if you have a lie masquerading as a fact, it means you don't have facts. If you don't have facts, you can't have truth. You can't have trust, right? I hear news organizations talk about building trust with the audience. You can't do that if the world's largest distributor of news is Facebook. And if Facebook, the platform, is designed in its design to divide, and it is designed to be biased against facts. So if we have no facts, you can't have democracy. Any meaningful human endeavor becomes difficult. And I think you have to add the last link, which is that because it's the toxicity part, right? Because the design, so one design choice of all social media platforms is they grow you grow your personal network, and they grow the platform by recommending friends of friends. But what's built into that one decision, it does work, but friends of friends means that it essentially tears apart societies, right? So for example, in the Philippines, I've seen from 2016 to 2020, when President Duterte was elected in May of 2016, a month before Brexit, we all agreed on the facts. We were in the center. We didn't disagree on facts. But over time, because of this friends of friends algorithm for growth, you see when pro Duterte supporters grow their network, they tend to move further right. When anti Duterte grow their network, they move further left. And the division, the chasm between, gets bigger and bigger as the networks grow. This is untenable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, before I say what I think, I'll be interested in your answer to this. I think one of the perennial questions is: does social media simply reflect divisions that exist in society caused by other effects, socioeconomic pressures in a changing world, or is social media amplifying that process? Is it pushing people along to the extremes? And what do you think? Do you think is it being driven by social media?
Yes, it's definitely been driven by social media. It isn't just a reflection. Look, I think that many people, the people who say that, don't live on social media, right? They don't understand it. It's, I like using this thing of the cartoons where you have a devil and an angel on your shoulder, and you, the human being, are constantly moving through life making choices, right? Well, imagine if the devil on your shoulder just was the only one allowed to speak, and kept telling you. It literally changes your beliefs. It happens in plain sight. This is the growth of the conspiracy theories, right? And the other added danger to that is not only is the change in the individual, and I've watched this in my friends, in my family and my friends. So your individual beliefs slowly change, and over time hugely changes. But then these networks that push to more radicalization, to more extremism, to more conspiracy theories, more hate. As they move there, these networks tend to get connected together, right? It is not a coincidence that the alt-right in Europe, in Canada, in the Philippines are connected. So these dangers as well as I do. But this is not a passive reflection. It would be great if it was, because then journalists would have the chance to be able to give you the facts, right? Essentially, what we're dealing with now is journalism, a thinking slow process, is having to fight in a thinking fast environment that's been created by social media that rewards extremist behavior, cursing, hate. that is what spreads, right? In that environment, you cannot have a fully functioning democracy.
I think that's right, and that is the big danger. And I agree with you that social media is driving these divisions. I think it will be impossible to think of the rise of a movement like QAnon, for example, a conspiracy
Yes.
theory network, without social media. I think it just wouldn't have been possible to not just capture people's attention, but get people marching in the streets in support of the most extreme, wild conspiracy theories.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, right, I started studying social media because I was looking at the spread of the radical ideology of terrorism, of Al Qaeda. I was tracking them as a reporter. I was tracking the growth of this virulent ideology in the networks, the physical social networks in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, and I was the second book I wrote is called From Bin Laden to Facebook. What I thought was it was fascinating to see how this virulent ideology spreads 4 times faster when you pump it up on social media, right? The social media platforms learn to deal with that. But here's the reality: the design of the social media platforms are actually accomplish exactly what a terrorist recruiter does, which is to isolate you, right? So the kinds of content, for example, let's talk about the content that's recommended to you on YouTube, right? Let's just say let's talk about a 9/11 conspiracy, right? You watch one, and the next one that's recommended to you becomes even more extremist. It radicalizes you if this is all you live on. And that's what we've seen with terrorist research, with the virulent ideology of terrorism. Well, what's political ideology or political speech, right? Especially if people are afraid the conditions of the pandemic. There's uncertainty about the future. There is fear that someone else will get something you don't. In my environment in the Philippines, we live in an environment of violence and fear. Tens of thousands, according to human rights groups, killed in a brutal drug war, and we have the fear of retribution for speaking up, for trying to hold government to account. So, in this environment, what do, right? And how much more radicalized do you get? Sorry, the last point I'll say is that the first step to radicalization is to isolate you. And the very design of the social media platforms actually do that because they take principles of neuroscience. So like how you get trapped in a casino, right? How the design of a casino is meant to keep you on that plot, to keep you gambling. Well, here, this kind of mild addiction triggering higher levels of dopamine in you, uh, the longer you stay on the platforms, the more radical you become, the more isolated you become, more prone you are to believe the conspiracy theories that are being fed to you.
I think with COVID, we're also seeing a very sort of dangerous side effect of this as well, in that the research shows that people who um, don't want to take a COVID vaccine, they don't think it's safe, and the sort of people that believe and share anti-vaccine conspiracy theories also tend to be sort of people that believe other conspiracy theories, have low trust in the media, low trust in governments and public information. And we can see, if you like, almost the direct public health consequences of allowing this sort of world of conspiracy to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the time of COVID, lies kill, right? And something like this again, we've had a dress rehearsal of this with measles and the anti-vaxxers. Even this has happened. I don't think it's a coincidence that in the Philippines, our incidence of measles increased last year because we had those same. When you become a victim of disinformation, you don't realize it. You just see the world differently. And this is a problem, right? Do you believe in vaccines or not? Well, that never used to be debated, really, right? Because we all agreed that you needed to get vaccinated. Um, QAnon, you said this earlier, these things flourish because of the design of social media. It feeds on the worst of human nature. And these things, frankly, should not be allowed, should be illegal. You should know. I mean, I shouldn't say things like that, right? Because it's just I'm the victim of these things. Right? People actually believe, some Filipinos now believe I'm a criminal because that's what they've been fed. What's your defense in something like that? It's difficult. You can't just keep doing your work. And this is why I continue to appeal to the social media platforms. I said this a few years ago. I had asked them, to really look at what's happening in the Philippines because their inaction could help send me to jail.
I think, as we sort of, before we bring our conversation to a close, I just wanted to talk about the sort of global aspect of this, because there's a sort of big debate now in I think in America, certainly in Europe and in the UK, about what the responsibilities of social media companies should be. The idea of creating regulators with supervising power to look at how they deal with harmful disinformation, to take action against them if they don't deal adequately and swiftly enough with disinformation that could clearly cause harm. And I think there needs to be, though, not just legislation in individual countries to establish that, but the idea of some global standards that we would hold these companies to, and that they, if they allowed their systems to be abused in a country away from Europe or the Americas, they would be, their reputational risk and indeed even the action that could be taken against them could be just as severe as it was if it had happened in their own country. Not just a mechanism for public shaming, but one to actually require certain standards to be met by the companies in how they act and deal with harmful disinformation, and also a requirement they act to stop the amplification of that disinformation on their platforms.
Yeah, yeah. So there's three things that I hear in what you said. The first is that until the social media platforms, until they are liable for what happens on their platform, they will keep happening, right? So how do you stop the impunity? Yes, regulation can be there, but what if it's the design that is at fault, right? And this is part of the alarm that I've really been trying to sound for the last few years, which is that essentially the social media has turned the world upside down, and it is very similar to what happened 75 years ago when the atom bomb exploded in Hiroshima. And when that happened, the world knew it needed to come together to prevent the worst of humanity from being unleashed, right? It's the same thing that's happened today. Information is power, and part of the problems, the core of the reason why democracy is being rolled back in so many countries around the world, why people are being individually changed, is because of the social media platform. So how do we deal with that? It's got to be a global response, and I hope it would be at the same scale of what happened post World War II, which, at the end of that, you had Bretton Woods, NATO, you had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a great of a starting point for principles that a social media platform should have, right? We all agreed to this. I mean, many of the countries around the world did. So without doing that, there won't be a systemic solution, and we won't be able to turn the world right side up. I think the last point in what you said, Damian, is that we in the global south bear the brunt of the decisions that have been made in Silicon Valley. And because our institutions are weaker, uh, it becomes life and death in countries like Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, right, in the Philippines. So it's important that, well, I guess the other point is watching the US elections and looking at how Americans had to deal with it, were forced to deal with it. It was Silicon Valley's sins coming home to roost. And America survived by a hair, right? So now what happens next? please bring some of the countries most affected to the table. And this is part of what I like about the work you have done. You've taken the rest of the world in, because it's critical. And so, note of optimism, right? I will say one thing that makes me, this is the good and the bad. What social media has proven is that human beings all around the world have far more in common than we have differences, because we are all being manipulated in the exact same way, right? So forget differences of culture or nationality. Social media has found a way, has understood the human psyche, and found a way to keep us on the platform, mildly addicted, but to connect us. Now the question is, can you have different design principles that will reward behavior, that will reward actions that are actually good for society, and not just for the social media platforms that are making loads and loads of money on it?
I think that's so important. I gave a speech in the House of Commons recently saying that, actually what we're talking about is not regulating speech, but regulating a business model that is based on
Correct.
engagement and doesn't care whether that engagement is based on harmful and misleading material rather than helpful and honest material. And that's what we need to focus on. And I think you're right as well. I think, making this a discussion, bringing in people from around the world is so important, because we're all looking at this problem from our own perspectives, but seeing similar issues that need to be resolved. And in fact, we're shortly about to have the 4th International Grand Committee of Parliamentarians, which will be held online, sadly, because of COVID. But I remember you gave evidence at the 2nd Grand Committee which was held in Ottawa. And I think it's so important that we get people working together around the world on trying to solve these problems.
Yeah, no, that hearing when you had when we were there, that hearing was mind blowing, because Shoshana Zuboff's book, "The Age of Surveillance Capitalism," changed changed the way I looked at my personal experiences. Because I'm also in a strange position, because Rappler is a Facebook partner. We are one of 2 Filipino fact-checking partners and we work closely with Facebook. In fact, I would say we knew Facebook in the Philippines better than Facebook did when they set up their offices here a few years ago. So I say we're frenemies, but beyond that now, I've seen both inside and outside. This is not tenable, the situation that the social media platforms have created. And the work you do becomes critically important for us. I guess that's part of the reason I've focused outside the Philippines, because, well, at the very least, I guess Mark Zuckerberg isn't going to try to shut us down, or maybe he could, right? The dangers are very high for me here in the Philippines. But the first step in trying to fight for democracy in my country is to stop the poison that is seeded and spreads on Facebook.
Absolutely. Now, Maria, I'd just like to bring in at this moment our regular guest on the podcast, Charles Creel, who, since we last spoke, has transitioned with his family from Fairhope, Alabama, where he was for the election period, to be with his partner's family in Oslo in Norway. Charles, it's great to have you with us. And tell us, in amongst your travels, what's caught your attention in the last few days?
Thanks, Damian. We're all watching the latest news on the COVID-19 vaccination announcements right now. Britain is rolling out the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine this week. In fact, by the time you hear this, it may well be in a few arms. And according to the RAPS website, that stands for Regulatory Affairs Professions Society, there are dozens of vaccines in the work, but 10 of those vaccines are in phase 3 trials. Now, these include the vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca. That last one is the Oxford vaccine. UK health officials expect to have up to 4 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine by the end of December, and that offers up to 95% protection against COVID-19. The government has also ordered enough of the drugs to vaccinate 1/3 of the country, and we expect vaccines to roll out in the US soon too, as the Pfizer vaccine wends its way through a kind of fast-track approval process, and the company is about to ship millions of those doses this month. So is COVID nearly over? Well, not really, because there's a problem, and the problem is disinformation. Normally, it would be difficult to convince an entire population to submit to a vaccination that's been rushed to market and rushed through testing. But in this disinformation environment, it seems the anti-vax movement may in fact endanger the goals of both countries' leading health officials, which is eradicating COVID-19, of course. Now, according to Newsweek and a Gallup poll that was taken just before the U.S. election, an eye-watering 42% of those people polled are unwilling to get vaccinated once a vaccine is available to them. 37% were concerned about the rush timeline. 26% want to wait to confirm the vaccine is safe. 12% don't trust vaccines at all, so they're anti-vaxxers in a way. 10% want to wait to see how effective the vaccine might be. And 15% state other reasons. It's too politicized, or they don't feel it's necessary, or something. According to the Center for Countering Digital Hate, there are currently 58 million anti-vaxxers online in the U.S. alone. Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we all know by now, has stated that if half of people don't take the vaccine, it will create a public health challenge. Now, we're currently in a public health crisis, so a challenge looks like an improvement, but all of us who make our living out of countering disinformation, particularly around health issues, well, we've got our work cut out for us.
Well, thank you, Maria. Thank you for joining us. And your work is so important, and I think what you're living through at the moment just shows you the real dangers that are there, and how powerful people can use that power to close down dissenting voices.
Thank you, Damian.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Maria Ressa and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all the proceeds will go towards the making of this podcast. Thank you. Until next time.